This screencast is going to be about qualitative coding with some practical advice and an explanation of my system. I'm leaving this slide up because I really like it, and I think it's important to kind of think about, particularly when thinking about qualitative research as well as in general, what gets branded as research, and to really own that you are a researcher. You're doing important, innovative research. And in your analysis, you're performing a scientific action, much like Ida B. Wells did, and much like Dr. Tamika Cross is, in fact, a doctor, and a damn good one. So I think sometimes qualitative research can get sort of the short end of the stick in how we talk, how it's talked about, and then how we think about it. That it can seem less than scientific. And I'm here to say that's really not true. And then just to repeat that, yeah, what good work you're doing, how much you are a researcher. So I want to talk a little bit about presenting data in qualitative research, or telling the story, and how to do that fairly, equitably, respectfully, accurately, and confidentially. And we'll talk more about confidentiality and how to de-identify in a meaningful way in class when we talk about ethics and validity. So telling the story is an art form, really, but it's also a science, and there's some general rules we always follow. One of them for me is always considering outliers. So an outlier is that when you're seeing a general trend, an outlier is something outside the trend, or something that that disagrees with other information you have. And those outliers are really important to pay attention to in qualitative analysis. Oftentimes, I'd say the most insight comes from people who don't fit, or whose stories don't fit the norm you're starting to see. And that really provides a lot of insight into the norm. And so after you organize your data, you get to the point of picking quotes that tell the story well, and we'll talk more about that at the end of the presentation. The biggest piece of advice I have is to just believe in your participants and carefully and critically consider the context, and that's something that you're all very good at. So there's two main kinds of coding or data analysis that you can choose to do. The first one is inductive coding. And so inductive research is research that starts with observation, or starts with data. And the way to remember that is that inductive starts with a vowel and observation starts with a vowel. So you're using observation to build theory. The opposite of inductive research is deductive research, in which you start with a theory and then use observations or data. You use what you're seeing to prove or disprove the theory. So those are two main branches of research in general, inductive and deductive. And if you're using an inductive analysis method, you're often using what's called, an example of that is what's called grounded coded analysis. And that's where as you read through your transcripts or look over your data, you're developing your code book as you go. So you're figuring out how you should categorize the data as you read it, which allows you to kind of generate new theories as you go. If you're using a deductive method of analysis, a common one used is content analysis. You're starting with a theory. And so according to that theory, you've developed a code book from the literature, from your experience, from what's already known. And then as you go through your transcripts, you're plugging your observations or your data into those codes that you've already developed. And that's not to say that you can't make changes to your code book. If you didn't initially have a code for something that you're seeing a lot of, you can absolutely add to a code book if you're using content analysis. But the difference is that in content analysis, you have at least an outline of how you're going to categorize your data, whereas with grounded coded analysis, you don't, and you're letting what the data in front of you determine how it's categorized. Both are valid methods of analyzing data that are used for different projects. I've done projects where content analysis is the appropriate analysis, and I've done projects where grounded coded analysis is the proper one. It depends on your research question. And so, as we talked about last semester, very long ago, in qualitative analysis, you begin with codes. And codes are just tags or descriptors almost that you apply. They're sort of first-line categories that you apply to your data. And then codes are used to build themes, which are sort of larger buckets that the different categories fall into. And then themes are used to build second-level themes, which are theories and relationships between the different themes. We're going to talk about coding first, and then we'll come back to themes and second-level themes. This lecture is really about organizing and managing your codes. And you can use various software programs to do that. Two popular ones that are also wicked expensive are called Atlas TI and NVivo, N-V-I-V-O. There's a freeware one called Deduce that I haven't used yet, but I've been hearing good things about when I'm, not too busy making potty humor jokes about Deduce. I am a highly professional researcher, and I use Excel to manage my codes, and we'll talk a little bit about how to do that. One probably isn't better or worse. I'm just attached to Excel because it's free with Office. So this is what my Excel coding sheets will look like. And for right now, ignore this theme thing. Oftentimes, I'll add in the theme later. So what this looks like when I begin a project is this theme column will be blank. The next column over is codes. So again, codes are just little descriptive tags that we're applying to our data to describe what's happening in it. I'll leave room for myself to write a definition of that code as I work with it more and refine it. I'll put in a definition of, what conditions does a quote from a transcript need to fit to be assigned this code, misunderstood by provider. Then the next column, then I have a column for every interview. So in this project, I've conducted 3 interviews, so I have 3 columns. And so what I'll do first is just read over, particularly if I'm doing grounded coded analysis or another inductive kind of analysis. I'll just start by reading over my transcript with a paper copy and a pen in my hand and marking codes that come to mind as I'm coding. I'll also do that with content analysis, just read over the transcript on paper with a pen in my hand and write in the codes that I think apply to each passage of the transcript, each quote in the transcript. I'll usually talk out loud to Sam while I do it. She's very good at coding. So that's the first thing I do. The second thing I do is I then, read over the transcript again in an electronic document. And whenever I see a passage or a quote that fits into the code, I will highlight it, copy it, and paste it in to the appropriate. So if in interview 1, the first time someone said something about being misunderstood by their provider, I copied and pasted it and put it right in this box for interview 1. Then at the end of the quote, I make this little hashtag symbol just to let me know in case the person says something else about being misunderstood by a provider, that this is a new quote beginning. And then I'll code all the way through interview 1, assigning or cutting and pasting all the quotes that fit one of my codes into the row that's about that code. And you'll notice that not every interview will talk about every code, and that's totally fine. So in this example, interview 2 didn't have anything to say about being misunderstood by a provider, but she had a lot of things to say about having good conversations with her provider. So I copied and pasted everything she had to say about having a good conversation with her provider, with hashtags in between each individual quote. And so I do this for all my interviews and all my codes. And you'll notice here, interview 3 is a little bit of an outlier for the code provider didn't ask. This interviewee said her provider always asks. So this will be an interview when I'm working more specifically with this code about provider didn't ask. And sometimes I'll even highlight it or bold it in Excel so I know to come back to interview 3. Interview 3 might be an outlier and will be worth spending some time analyzing. So once I've gone through and applied all the different codes I can think of, I've coded all my interviews, the next step is to come up with themes. And so this theme here, patient-provider communication, is an example of collapsing, of coding by collapsing. So I had 4 different elements of patient-provider, client-provider communication, and I grouped them all into one theme about communication barriers. Sometimes I'll do the opposite thing. I'll do what's called splitting. So some of the quotes in that I coded initially as provider didn't understand might relate to times that the provider didn't want to understand or actively dismiss the client. But other times, the codes in my the codes that I originally grouped under provider doesn't understand were because of language barriers. And when I'm organizing my data into themes, I might decide I want to have one theme about providers dismissing the client and another theme about a language barrier. Because, while the end result is the same, that the provider didn't understand, I might want to have some themes about these reasons because they're very different issues from each other, a language barrier versus actively dismissing someone. So eventually you'll end up with a code book where all your codes have been grouped into themes sometimes. So again, this is an example of grouping a bunch of codes together into a single theme, and you might have some that are that have fewer codes, or even just one code or a part of a code inside the theme. So eventually you end up with a list of first-level themes and associated codes. And that's when it gets fun, or if you're not me, other people describe this as terrible. I think this is really, some people love this stage, some people hate it. Both are fine. So this is a stage of looking for second-level themes and weaving your themes, your first-level themes, into a cohesive story. So this is a screenshot of that show Scandal. It's, early Scandal because Harrison, the character Harrison, is still alive. I recognize his suspenders. I hope this isn't too big a spoiler alert. Harrison lives forever, guys, if you haven't seen the 5th season of Scandal. So anyway, Harrison and Quinn here are organizing a bunch of themes or categories of information into a story using that technique where they, you also see this sometimes in, crime shows where the cops have or the investigators have a bunch of pictures and notes and relationships up on a board, and they're looking for relationships between these pictures, or in our case, themes. And this is, again, where outliers become really important. You want to look at the outliers. So what doesn't fit the general patterns that you're seeing, and why not? How are these separate? So in Olivia Pope's office, each little row here of windows could be thought of as a different theme. And each of these photos could represent a code within that theme. So if you've grouped your codes into themes, into windows, and now you're looking for relationships between the windows. So this gun here belonged to this woman, for example, or this naval officer, I believe, knew these groups of people. So you're looking at relationships and looking at the overall story of what happened and what Olivia Pope's next move needs to be. So finally, you've organized your information, and the last step is telling the story. So you're looking for quotes that illustrate the story. So oftentimes you'll see in a qualitative paper, there'll be some narrative discussion of the theme or the second level theme, and then there'll be 2 or 3 quotes that illustrate that theme. So you could have what are called representative quotes. So those are things like you're looking for participants who shared a common idea really eloquently, who really articulated something important about the theme, or whose experience can really speak to or represent other experiences. And so you would quote that using good confidentiality, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Another kind of quote you can have is outlier quotes. So I've written papers where I say things like, though it was very common for people with intellectual disabilities to talk about being dismissed by their provider, 2 people we interviewed in this study felt that never happened and had really good relationships with their providers where they didn't feel dismissed at all. And then I'll give a quote from one of the participants talking about that really good relationship she has with her healthcare provider. And then I'll spend a little bit of time discussing how. So in this quote, the participant talked about how her provider always asked her opinion, and what she, and supported her in making decisions and told her that she had decision-making authority. She was the only person who said that her provider, informed her of her different options. And that might explain her outlier status. That might explain why she was different from other participants and had such a good relationship. Whatever kind of quotes you're using, you want to use really good confidentiality and make sure to change all identifiers. So, and changing names is not enough. Oftentimes, if someone says, for example, I interviewed someone who was a woman who worked in a highly technical industry in Massachusetts, where she was one of the few women in management in this particular industry. And so it wasn't enough for me to just change her name and not list her exact precise position or company. I had to go through, and every time she said the name of her industry, so she would say things like, it's really hard for women in computer programming. It wasn't computer programming. And so every time she said computer programming, I would change it to industry. And I would just write in brackets industry, rather than naming the industry. The same is true of, so I haven't done these interviews, but I would love to interview people who are residents of one of the 2 remaining institutions for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in Massachusetts. Were I to ever get that project funded, which, don't hold your breath. I'm not, highly hopeful, but we'll see. But if I ever manage to get that program, that study funded, it wouldn't be enough because we're talking about a group of maybe 400 people total in a small state, a geographically small state, who live in one of 2 well-known institutions. So I would have to do a lot more than just change the name of the institution. I probably couldn't reveal the state that I was working in. And I would have to do a lot of thinking around when people said stuff like, it was snowing out. I might just black that part out completely. Just, take a Sharpie and cross that off because that, is distinguishing our winters from Arizona winters, and letting people know that these institutions are located somewhere, in a snowy climate. So really kind of thinking through how to de-identify in a meaningful way beyond just changing names. That being said, I've also done interviews where people are identifiable and they want to be identified. So a project also that our grant did not go through, surprisingly, we're resubmitting it. So a grant I wrote where we were looking at leadership in the neurodiversity movement, the autistic self-advocacy movement, which has some real, which is a fairly small group of people, many of whom are well known, are national and international leaders. And so one thing we talked about was, we were planning to do these interviews with leaders who are very proud of their activism and their advocacy. And some of the people we talked to in the process, the leaders we talked to, who, had we been funded, would be our interview participants, we're really clear about not wanting to be de-identified, wanting to be credited. So that's something you can talk with your participants about. Do you have a participant who really wants to be identified? And if so, obviously talk to me and talk to the IRB about it. There's no reason you can't identify that person with their explicit written consent and, true informed consent. And I would say the biggest lesson I've learned is that in, organizing qualitative data and telling the story, going back to participants and going back to the community, giving them an opportunity to review your work and let you know whether you're representing them well and accurately and fairly and respectfully. If possible, pay people to do this if you're doing a funded project, which I know no one here is, but in your future career as researchers, that the technical word for this is member checking. But I really think of it as a form of accountability to my community. If people are sharing their stories with me, what am I doing to be accountable to them, to their stories, and making sure that I'm presenting data in a meaningful, equitable way.